Britain robbed India of 45 trillion, and thence 1.8 billion Indians died from deprivation. That was January 15th, 2019. Originally published, Countercurrents by Dr. Gideon Polya, December 28th, 2018. Eminent Indian economist Professor Utsa Patnaik, Jawaharlal Nehru University, has estimated that Britain robbed India of 45 trillion with a T, between 1765 and 1938. However, it is estimated that if India had remained free, with 24% of world GDP, as in 1700, then its cumulative GDP would have been 232 trillion with a T, greater. That's from 1700 to 2003, and 44 trillion greater, 1700 to 1950. Deprivation kills, and it is estimated that 1.8 billion with a B, Indians died avoidably from egregious deprivation under the British, 1757 to 1947. The deadly impact of British occupation of India lingers today, 71 years after independence, with 4 million people dying avoidably from deprivation each year in capitalist India as compared to 0 in China. Professor Utsat Patnaik is Professor Emeritus at Nehru University, New Delhi. Utsat Patnaik is a Marxist economist and taught at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in the School of Social Sciences at Nehru University from 1973 until her retirement in 2010. She obtained her PhD in economics from Oxford University, UK, and has researched the transition from agricultural peasant societies to industrial societies and food security and poverty, especially in India. Utsa Patnaik's latest book, co-authored with Prabhat Patnaik, is, quote, A Theory of Imperialism, end quote. That was published in 2016. We all know that the British rapaciously exploited India. Professor Utsat Patnaik has estimated the magnitude of the British robbing of India thus, quote, between 1765 and 1938, the drain amounted to 9.2 trillion with a T, pounds, that's $45 trillion, taking India's export surplus earnings as the measure and compounding it at a 5% rate of interest, end quote. After the betrayal and defeat of Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah, please excuse my pronunciations, I'm probably slaughtering these things, at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the British installed their own puppet, Mir Jafar, as Nawab. The British extracted huge concessions from the defeated Bengalis, including land, a monopoly of trade with Europe, and exemption from taxation on internal trade. The British subsequently replaced Mir Jafar with Mir Qasim as Nawab of Bengal. The Bengalis under Mir Qasim were finally driven to revolt when he was in turn sacked by the British and replaced by Mir Jafar for a second term. The Bengalis were defeated at the Battle of Buxar in 1764, and in 1765 the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam was, quote, persuaded, end quote, to grant the power of taxation, Diwani, in Bengal to the British East India Company. The British in turn subcontracted rapacious revenue collection to Bengalis. Some of the revenue would go to the emperor and some to the Nawab, with the remainder being retained by the British. The British described this as, quote, farming, end quote, the Bengali peasants, the riots. But overtaxing of Bengalis meant that 10 million Bengalis perished in the Great Bengal Famine of 1769 to 1770. The East India Company used about 1/3 of the collected revenue to buy Indian goods, and thus the Bengalis were in effect being paid for their goods through the exorbitant taxes applied to them. 15 years later, exorbitant British taxation led to famine in the Gangetic Plan to the west of Bengal. Indeed, such British excesses led to the British Parliament unsuccessfully impeaching Warren Hastings, first Governor General of India and father by adultery of Jane Austen's cousin Eliza, for crimes such as the violation of the Bengums of Udhi, was, of course, eventually acquitted. I'm sorry about these pronunciations. By the 1840s, the East India Company had dominion over most of present-day India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, but the British government was increasingly keen for greater involvement in the exploitative proceedings. In 1847, the British government introduced a scheme whereby those wishing to buy Indian goods could only do so using council bills issued by the British Crown in London. Traders would pay for such bills in gold and silver and use them to pay Indian producers, who would in turn cash them in for rupees at the local colonial office, rupees that had been exacted by exorbitant taxation. In his book Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India, Shashi Tharoor describes how the British looted and deindustrialized India and thus paid for Britain's industrial revolution and violent global dominance. Quote, "At the beginning of the 18th century, as the British economic historian Angus Maddison has demonstrated, India's share of the world economy was 23%, as large as all of Europe put together. It had been 27% in 1700, when the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb's treasury raked in £100 million in tax revenues alone. By the time the British departed India, it had dropped to just over 3%. The reason was simple. India was governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India," end quote. This deadly and merciless taxation was accompanied by massive deindustrialization of India. Thus, before the invasion by the British, India led the world in textiles, agriculture, and metallurgy, but rapidly became an exporter of raw materials and an importer of goods manufactured in Britain. Professor Utsak Panak's estimate of Britain's theft from India, amounting to $45 trillion, 1765 to 1938, can be accompanied with estimates based on GDP considerations. According to Wikipedia, India's share of the world economy declined from 24.4% in 1700 to 4.2% in 1950. India's share of global industrial output declined from 25% in 1750 to 2% in 1900. From available data on India's GDP and India's share of world GDP since 1700, one can get a very rough estimate of what India's cumulative GDP could have been from 1700 to 2003 if the British had not robbed and raped India. Thus, the cumulative GDP for India is given below for periods since 1700 at the observed average percent of world GDP, and if the average Indian percent of world GDP had remained at the pre-British invasion, 24% in 1770. And you can have a look at those figures there. It has taken India 7 decades to partially recover from 2 centuries of rapacious British imperialism. The difference in cumulative GDP is $316.4 trillion, 1700 to 2003, and $44 trillion from 1700 to 1950, the latter estimate of India's deprivation being consonant with Professor Utsa Patnak's estimate that the British had stolen $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938. Imposed poverty kills. Poverty-derived avoidable mortality, avoidable death, excess mortality, excess death, premature death, untimely death, death that should not have happened, can be estimated as the difference between the actual deaths in the country and the deaths expected for a peaceful, decently governed country with same demographics, birth rate and percentage of children. Below are listed in rough chronological order some shocking salient features of the deadly impact of rapacious British imperialism over 2 centuries in British India, Britain's Auschwitz. In 1769 to 1770, the Great Bengal Famine, 10 million out of 30 million overtaxed Bengalis starved to death. Scores of millions of Indians perished in man-made famines between the 1769 and 1770, the Great Bengal Famine, and the 1942 to 1945 World War II Bengal Famine. Using Indian census data 1870 to 1950, assuming an Indian population of about 200 million in the period 1760 to 1870, and estimating by interpolation from available data an Indian avoidable death rate in deaths per 1,000 of population of 37 between 1757 and 1920, 35 between 1920 and 1930, 30 from 1930 to 1940, and 24 from 1940 to 1950, one can estimate Indian excess deaths of 592 million between 1757 and 1837, 497 million between 1837 to 1901, and 418 million 1901 to 1947, roughly 1.5 billion, billion with a B, in total, or 1.8 billion, billion with a B, including the native states. Scores of millions of distant British keeping hundreds of millions of Indians on the edge of starvation was enabled by relatively small numbers of British soldiers and much greater numbers of well-fed Indian soldiers threatening requisite violence. It has been estimated by Amaresh Misra that 10 million Indians were massacred in the decade after 1857, Indian Mutiny, Indian Rebellion, as reprisals for 2,000 British deaths. Despite a very high birth rate, the Indian population did not increase between 1860, that's 292 million, and 1934, 292 million. This is indicative of massive avoidable deaths from imposed deprivation that can be estimated as 740 million between 1860 and 1934, or an average of about 10 million Indian avoidable deaths from deprivation per year. Addressing the House of Commons in 1935, racist, imperialist and mass murderer Winston Churchill made an extraordinary confession in stating of the subjugated Indians, quote, "In the standard of life they have nothing to spare. The slightest fall from the present standard of life in India means slow starvation and the actual squeezing out of life, not only of millions but of scores of millions of people who have come into the world at your invitation and under the shield and protection of British power," end quote. 7 years later, Churchill commenced the deliberate starving to death over 4 years of 6.7 million Indians in Bengal, Orissa, Bihar, and Assam, as the British exported grain from India and slashed grain imports. In 1942 to 1945, World War II, Bengali Holocaust, the Indian Holocaust, World War II Bengal famine, 6.7 million Indians were deliberately starved to death for strategic reasons by the British and Australian complicity. Australia was complicit by denying starving India food from its huge wartime food stores. This atrocity has been whitewashed from history and general public perception by successive generations of Anglo journalists, editor, politician, and academic prostitutes. Indeed, perpetrator Churchill made no mention for this atrocity in his 6-volume history, quote, "The Second World War," end quote, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. According to Professor Utsa Patnak, India per capita annual consumption of food was 200 kilograms in 1900, but went down to 137 kilograms during World War II and in 1946. This is consonant with the following data from my book, quote, "Jane Austen and the Black Hole of British History," end quote. Quote, "The population of India at the time, 1940, was about 400 million, and total grain production was 50 to 70 million tons annually. The population was growing at a rate of about 5% per year, and there was a requirement of net imports of about 1.1 to 2 million tons of grain per annum to make up for deficiencies." Barron's figures for grain shipments in tons for India in 1942 to 1945 are as follows: 1942, 30,000, 1943, 303,000, 1944, 639,000, and 1945, 871,000. The 1942 shipment involved 2 lots from Australia, contracted for at the rate of 15 tons per month to supply the Indian Army. The balance of the demand was not shipped that year. 2.4 million men served in the Indian Army during World War II. This estimate can be, quote, reduced, end quote, since not all of these were in the army at the same time. Scores of thousands were in the Mediterranean theatre, 250,000 served there, had been captured by the Japanese or had died. Taking the gross Indian annual grain production estimates of about 60 million tonnes for 400 million people, we see that the average consumption was 0.15 tonnes per person per year, obviously more for adults and less for children. The annual requirement for about 2 million men in the, quote, reduced, end quote, Indian Army was therefore 0.3 million tonnes. We can arrive at a figure having a similar order of magnitude from the 1942 contracted requirement of 15,000 tonnes per month, that is 0.18 million tonnes for a whole year. If we assume that an Indian Army soldier required 50% more food than the average Indian, we would estimate that the annual grain requirement for a 2 million strong Indian Army would be about 0.45 million tonnes. The average yearly importation in 1942 to 1945 was 0.46 million tonnes, and thus we can see that the grain actually imported was merely enough to feed the Indian Army. Shashi Tharoor in, quote, Inglorious Empire, end quote, quote, the British left a society with 16% literacy, a life expectancy of 27, practically no domestic industry, and over 90% living below what today we would call the poverty line. As indicated in number 6 above, the life expectancy of 27 years corresponded to about 10 million Indian avoidable deaths from deprivation per year. Things got much better after Indian independence. The 1.8 billion, that's billion with a B, avoidable Indian deaths from deprivation under the genocidal British over 2 years is not that surprising when one considers that despite modern medicine, antibiotics, and the essential absence of famine, avoidable deaths from deprivation in the period of 1950 to 2005 in India totaled 0.35 billion. Annual avoidable deaths as a percentage of population fell from a genocidal 2.4% per year in 1947 under the British to 0.35% per year in 2005, but the population of India increased from 380 million in 1947 to about 1,100 million in 2005. Today, 4 million Indians die avoidably from deprivation each year as compared to 0 in China, that, unlike capitalist India, has overcome endemic poverty. The 3 laws of thermodynamics that underlie chemistry, physics, and industry are 1. The energy of a closed system is constant. 2. The entropy, disorder, lack of information content strives to a maximum. And 3. There is 0 molecular motion in a pure crystal at absolute 0 degrees Kelvin, negative 273.15 degrees centigrade. Polya's 3 laws of economics are based on 3 laws of thermodynamics and posit that 1. Price, cost of production, profit, deception about COP strives to a maximum, and 3. No work price or profit on a dead planet. The major cost of production, COP, in the British Raj was the passive mass murder of 1.8 billion with a B, Indians through deadly impoverishment. And in keeping with Polya's 2nd law of economics, the British strove to deceive the world about this horror. The capitalist perpetrator deception continues in a neoliberal 1%er dominated that is existentially threatened by nuclear weapons. A nuclear winter from nuclear war would wipe out most of humanity and the biosphere. Poverty, 15 million people die avoidably from deprivation each year, 4 million in India. And man-made climate change, about 1 million people die from climate change each year, but this set to increase to an average of 100 million deaths per year this century if urgent, requisite action is not taken. Poverty kills. History ignored yields, history repeated. Peace is the only way, but silence kills, and silence is complicity. Please inform everyone you can. So there's the references there. This is completely referenced. I actually saw this via Jason Unruhe's site. Jason Unruhe has done his own research on the figures he thinks that capitalism has killed. That's not including India. And he came up with, I think it was 1.6 billion. So if you have the 1.6 billion and the 1.8 billion of the people that capitalism has killed in India, that's 3.4 billion people that capitalism has killed. And he was saying that that should put a lid on and a last nail in the coffin the complaints, the disingenuous claims that socialism has killed 200 million people. That is actually not true. But even if it were true, if capitalism has killed 3.4 billion with a B people, and I'd say it's probably even more than that when you consider other factors, but let's just say it's 3.4 billion, which is almost half the population of the planet at this present time. I mean, that's appalling. And of course, there's going to be a lot more that unfettered capitalism, a lot more people unfettered capitalism is going to kill in the years to come, a lot more. So anyway, I thought this was very interesting. It's completely referenced, as you can see, so I'll leave a link to this essay by Dr. Gideon Polya. Dr. Gideon Polya taught science students at a major Australian university for 4 decades. He published some 130 works in a 5-decade scientific career, most recently a huge pharmacological reference text, Biochemical Targets of Plant Bioactive Compounds. Anyway, I won't read all of that, but looks like very interesting articles and books that he has written. And so I invite you to, this is from mronline.org, and the title is Britain Robbed India of 45 trillion, and thence 1.8 billion Indians died from deprivation. I thought this was pretty horrifying. I knew about the Bengali, I knew about the famine that Churchill had caused, and so anybody that's singing his praises really, and they're not mentioning that, is sort of very strange to me. But anyway, it's sort of appalling, absolutely appalling that this has happened, and you rarely hear about it. So please share this mronline.org article, because it's an important thing that people should know. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. My name is Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Click the notifications bell, otherwise you don't receive notifications when I drop a video. Click the like button if you like the content. And if you're not vegan, please consider going vegan. That definitely not only addresses the violence in the world that is toward non-human animals at 1 to 3 trillion aquatic and land animals every year for completely trivial reasons, but it'll also significantly address the climate crisis that is happening. And that's science-backed. And you know those 2 memes that I like to post, and I'll drop them in here. So thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. Till next time. Bye for now.